There are moments on that stage when the truth is so suffocating, it feels like the oxygen has been sucked out of the room. It's not about the yelling, it's not about the tears, though we certainly get plenty of both. It's about the silence after a question hangs in the air, a question that corners a person's long-held, carefully constructed reality. You see their whole world flicker in their eyes. This was one of those moments. The man's name was Mark, and he had come to my stage with a story so polished, so rehearsed, he could have sold it on late-night television. The title of his story was simple: My Wife is Ruining My Life. When I first met Mark backstage, he had the air of a man who felt deeply misunderstood. He was in his late 40s, but he carried himself with the wounded posture of an adolescent artist whose parents just don't get his vision. He had this soft-spoken, almost gentle way of explaining how his wife, Sarah, was the anchor tied to his feet while he was trying to swim for the shore of his dreams. He used phrases like subtle sabotage and passive-aggressive control. He painted a picture of a woman who on the surface was supportive, but in the dark, quiet corners of their life, she was a master of undermining his confidence, questioning his ambition, and creating a home environment so filled with anxiety that he couldn't possibly succeed. Sarah, on the other hand, was almost invisible when she first walked in. She was a ghost in her own life story. She sat beside him on the couch in my pre-interview room, and her energy was one of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. It wasn't the kind of tired you get from a long day at work. It was a soul-deep weariness, the kind that comes from fighting a war of attrition against an enemy you can't even name. Every time Mark spoke, she would flinch, just a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, as if bracing for a blow. He'd say something like, "And Sarah, bless her heart, she just doesn't understand the pressure I'm under," and he'd pat her knee. It was meant to look like a gesture of affection, but watching it, it felt more like a reminder of ownership. It was a physical manifestation of, we're a team as long as you play your part in my version of the story. The central problem, as Mark defined it, was his string of professional failures. He was a perennial entrepreneur, always on the cusp of the next big thing. There was a custom furniture business that never got out of the garage, a revolutionary app that someone else beat him to market with, and a consulting gig that fizzled out. For each failure, he had a corresponding story about how Sarah's negativity or lack of faith had been the critical flaw. For the furniture business, she'd expressed concern about him quitting his stable job. In his narrative, this wasn't prudence, it was a vote of no confidence that poisoned the well. For the app, her questions about the business plan were incessant nagging that broke his creative focus. He wasn't just saying she was unsupportive, he was saying she was the architect of his demise. He had successfully cast himself as the tragic hero and her as the unwitting or perhaps witting villain. People who live in a world of blame have one thing in common. They have an allergic reaction to accountability. Their ego is so fragile that the slightest admission of fault feels like a catastrophic failure. So they build a fortress of excuses, and they surround that fortress with a moat of blame. Mark's fortress was impenetrable. He had an answer for everything. When I'd ask about his own role in these business failures, the conversation would perform a kind of gravitational slingshot, always swinging back to something Sarah had said or done. It was masterful in its own way. A truly skilled manipulator doesn't just lie to you, they make you feel like questioning them is an act of aggression. They create a reality bubble, and they are the absolute authority within it. Outside my door, the world saw Mark as a guy who couldn't get his act together. But inside his reality bubble, he was a misunderstood genius, and Sarah was his gatekeeper. The label he wore was victim. The label he'd slapped on her was saboteur. My job was to peel those labels off and see what was really underneath. Because I've been doing this for a long time, and one thing I know for sure is that the story people lead with is rarely the real story. The real story is the one they don't even know they're telling. I started by digging into their history because the problems people bring to me today are almost always rooted in the patterns of yesterday. You don't wake up one morning in a toxic marriage. You build it brick by painful brick over years. Mark and Sarah met in college. He was, in his own words, a dreamer, a little bit of a rebel, and she was grounded, studious, and organized. He found her stability attractive, but not in the way a healthy person finds a partner. He saw it as a resource. She was the solid launch pad from which his rocket could take off. For Sarah, Mark was exciting. He was full of passion and big ideas, a stark contrast to her own more cautious nature. She saw her role as the quiet supporter, the one who would manage the details so the artist could create. This is a classic dynamic I see all the time. It's the dreamer and the doer. On the surface, it looks like a complementary partnership, but it can curdle into a codependent, dysfunctional system if both parties aren't self-aware. In their case, it curdled fast. The very first business idea he had, a t-shirt company he wanted to run from his dorm room, set the template for their entire relationship. He came up with the slogans, the grand vision. She was the one who researched vendors, figured out pricing, and handled the money. When it failed to make a profit after 2 months, he didn't say, well, that was a tough market, or maybe my slogans weren't as great as I thought. He said, Sarah's caution held us back. She was too worried about the upfront cost, and that hesitation made us miss our window. Right there, that's the genesis of the narrative. It wasn't a lie, not in his mind. It was a reinterpretation of reality to protect his ego. He couldn't handle the simple truth that his idea wasn't viable. So he created a more palatable truth. His idea was brilliant, but it was sabotaged by his partner's lack of vision. Sarah, being young and in love and conditioned to be a peacemaker, absorbed that. She thought, maybe he's right, maybe I was too nervous. She took on a piece of his failure as her own, not realizing she was setting a precedent. Every time she did that, she handed him another brick to build his fortress of blame. Over 2 decades, this pattern calcified. He would launch into a new venture with manic energy, making grand pronouncements at family dinners. Sarah would be the one quietly trying to balance the checkbook, wondering how they were going to pay the mortgage if this new venture required them to dip into their savings again. Her very legitimate, very responsible questions. Mark, have you drafted a full business plan? Or what's our contingency if we don't get investors in the first 6 months? Were not heard as questions of a supportive partner. They were logged in his mind as evidence of her betrayal. He'd accuse her of poking holes in his dreams, of having a poverty mindset, of being the voice of negativity that he had to fight against every single day, not just out in the world, but in his own home. The psychological mechanism at play here is called projection. Mark was terrified of failure. He was terrified that deep down, he wasn't the genius he presented himself to be. That fear was so profound, he couldn't even look at it. So he took that fear and he projected it onto her. She became the embodiment of his self-doubt. By fighting her, he felt like he was fighting his own demons. It's a clever, albeit unconscious, trick of the mind. If she is the problem, then he doesn't have to be. If he can defeat her arguments, he can quiet the voice in his own head that says, what if you're just not good enough? Sarah, for her part, was caught in a cycle of learned helplessness. Her identity had become so enmeshed with his that she didn't know who she was without him. Her value in her own mind was tied to her ability to support his dreams. So when he accused her of being unsupportive, it was a direct shot at her core sense of self. To defend herself would mean dismantling the very foundation of her marriage and her identity. So she'd retreat, she'd apologize. She'd try harder to be the supportive wife he claimed he wanted, which of course was impossible because what he wanted wasn't a supporter, he wanted a scapegoat. The more she tried to help, the more ammunition she gave him for the next time things went wrong. She was in a game where the rules were constantly changing, and the only rule that stayed the same was that she was destined to lose. The escalation, when it came, was predictable in its pattern, but shocking in its intensity. It centered around what Mark called his legacy project. This wasn't some small-time furniture business. This was his magnum opus. He had an idea for a tech platform, something with a vague and grandiose name, Ethelred, he called it, that would use AI to optimize personal and professional synergy. Now, I've heard 1,000 pitches like this. They're heavy on buzzwords and light on specifics. When I pressed him on what it actually did, he couldn't give me a straight answer. It was a word salad of disruption, paradigm shifts, and monetizing potential. The problem wasn't the idea itself, as flimsy as it was. The problem was the funding. Mark had decided, without any meaningful conversation with Sarah, that this venture required their entire nest egg, not just their savings, not just the emergency fund. He was talking about taking out a second mortgage on their home, and this was the part that finally broke Sarah. Cashing out the college funds they had spent 18 years building for their 2 children. He announced this not as a proposal, but as a done deal. He presented it to her one evening as if he were bestowing a great gift upon the family. "This is it," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with that manic energy she knew so well. "This is the one that sets us up for life. The kids won't need college funds because they'll be inheriting an empire." For 20 years, Sarah had bent. She had compromised, she had rationalized, she had absorbed his blame. But the currency of their relationship had always been their own future. Now, he was trying to cash a check written against their children's future, and something in her finally snapped. She had been a frog in a pot of slowly boiling water, and he had just cranked the heat to high. She said no. For the first time, it wasn't a hesitant question or a gentle expression of concern. It was a flat, unequivocal, "No, you are not touching the kids' money." This was a declaration of war. In Mark's reality bubble, her no wasn't an act of maternal protection. It was the ultimate act of betrayal. He didn't just get angry, he launched a campaign. It was a masterclass in emotional coercion. First came the gaslighting. "We talked about this, Sarah. You were on board. Don't you remember? You said you'd support me no matter what." She had never agreed to this, of course, but he said it with such conviction that for a moment she even questioned her own memory. He was trying to invalidate her reality. When that didn't work, he moved to martyrdom. He would sigh dramatically whenever she entered a room. He'd sit in the dark, staring out the window, a portrait of the tortured artist whose muse had abandoned him. He'd say things like, "It's fine. I'll just go back to some soul-crushing 9-to-5 job. My dreams don't matter. As long as everyone else feels safe." He was framing her responsible decision as an attack on his very soul. He made her the villain in a story where he was the only one willing to take a risk for the family's betterment. But the final, most destructive escalation was when he weaponized their children. He started making comments in front of them. "You know, I had a plan to build a company that you could run one day, but your mother doesn't believe in me." He'd say it with a sad, wistful smile, positioning himself as the fun, visionary dad and Sarah as the rigid, anxious fun killer. He was actively trying to create a fracture in their family, forcing his kids to choose a side. This is a level of manipulation that is profoundly damaging, because you're not just poisoning a marriage, you're poisoning a child's sense of security and their relationship with a parent. That was the point of no return. The house became a pressure cooker of tension, blame, and whispered arguments. Sarah was losing ground. She was exhausted, isolated, and beginning to believe that maybe she was the crazy one. And that's when Mark played his trump card. You know what? He said one night, if you think I'm the problem, let's go tell the whole world. Let's go see Dr. Phil. I've got nothing to hide. Let's see what he has to say when I tell him my wife refuses to support my efforts to build a better life for our family. You have to understand the genius of this move from a manipulator's perspective. He wasn't suggesting it to find a solution. He was suggesting it because he believed his version of reality was so compelling, so airtight, that he could sell it to me and by extension to a national audience. He saw it as the ultimate stage for his victimhood. He thought he would be vindicated. Sarah, on the other hand, agreed for a completely different reason: desperation. She had nothing left to lose. She felt like she was drowning, and my show was the last desperate hand reaching down to pull her out of the water. She didn't come to win an argument. She came to find out if she was sane. So there they sat on my stage under the hot lights. The audience was quiet. Mark launched into his opening monologue, and it was a pitch-perfect performance. He was calm, articulate, and sympathetic. He laid out his case against Sarah with the precision of a prosecutor. He talked about her fear-based decision-making, her constant questioning, and the emotional weight of her lack of faith. He painted himself as a loving husband who was just trying to break free from the shackles of mediocrity for the good of his family. He even shed a single, well-timed tear as he spoke about wanting to leave a legacy for his children. It was compelling. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd be convinced. The audience was leaning in, nodding. They were buying it. Sarah just sat there, shrinking into the couch. Every word he said seemed to land like a physical blow, and she absorbed each one with a quiet, defeated resignation. When I turned to her and asked for her side, she was hesitant. Her voice was barely a whisper. She'd start a sentence and then stop, looking over at Mark as if for permission to speak. Well, I just worry about the finances, she'd stammer. I'm not trying to be negative, but we have to be realistic. Mark would immediately jump in, but not with anger. Oh no, that would be too obvious. He'd jump in with that condescendingly gentle tone. See, this is what I'm talking about, Dr. Phil. Realistic. To her, realistic means small. It means safe. It means giving up before you even start. I'm trying to teach our kids to dream big, and she's teaching them to manage expectations. He was framing her prudence as a character flaw. It was psychological jujitsu. He was using her strengths, her stability, her practicality, and twisting them into weaknesses. I let him talk. I gave him enough rope. I needed to see the whole architecture of his narrative before I started pulling out the foundation bricks. I asked him about specific business failures, and for each one, he had a perfectly crafted story of Sarah's subtle sabotage. The pattern was flawless. It was never his misjudgment of the market, his lack of a concrete plan, or his own wavering commitment. It was always an external force, and that external force was almost always Sarah. The confrontation began not with a hammer, but with a scalpel. I had to bypass the fortress of blame and get to the man hiding inside it. After he finished a particularly long and eloquent explanation of how Sarah's concern over their savings had created a cloud of negative energy that scuttled his consulting business, I just paused. I let the silence hang in the air for a good 10 seconds. He looked at me, expecting me to turn to Sarah and ask her to account for her negativity. Instead, I looked straight at him. "Mark," I said, my voice very quiet, very calm, "let's take Sarah completely out of the equation for a minute. Let's pretend she doesn't exist. Let's pretend you're single. Tell me about a time you failed and it was 100% on you." It was like I'd asked him to solve a calculus problem in a foreign language. He blinked. He started to answer, and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain was whirring, trying to access a file that didn't exist. Well, every partnership has dynamics. He started to deflect. I cut him off, still calm. No dynamics, no partnership, just you, a business idea and the outcome. Tell me about a failure that was yours and yours alone. He couldn't do it. He literally could not formulate a sentence in which he was the sole agent of his own failure. He tried. He said, "Well, there was one time when the market shifted unexpectedly." The market shifted, I repeated. So the market failed you. You didn't fail to anticipate the market. It was a black swan event, he said, grabbing for a business cliche. Okay, I said, leaning forward, let's talk about Ethelred, your legacy project. You said you needed to cash out your kids' college funds for it. Did you do a valuation of the company? Did you have a single investor lined up? Did you have a prototype? Did you have a term sheet? Did you have anything other than a name and a handful of buzzwords? He looked stunned. I was no longer playing the game by his rules. I was asking for facts, for data, for accountability. His polished narrative was built on a foundation of emotion and blame, not concrete reality. He started to stammer about pre-seed stages and conceptualization phases. So, the answer is no, I said, keeping the pressure on. You had nothing. You had an idea, and you were willing to gamble your children's entire future on an idea you hadn't even bothered to properly vet. Now, here's my question, Mark. Is it Sarah's fault that you didn't do your homework? Is it her fault that you wanted to make a reckless, high-stakes bet with money that wasn't just yours? This was the first crack in the dam. His face, which had been a mask of composed victimhood, began to crumble. A flash of anger, real anger, crossed his face. "You're twisting this," he said, his voice rising. "You're taking her side." "I'm not taking anyone's side, Mark. I'm on the side of the truth. And the truth is, you've spent 20 years creating a narrative where you are the hero and your wife is the obstacle. But I've been listening to you for an hour, and I haven't heard you take ownership of a single thing. Every failure is someone else's fault. Every setback is a betrayal. Do you know what that's called?" He just stared at me, his jaw tight. I let the question hang there, then I answered it for him. "That's not being a victim, Mark. That's being a manipulator." The word hit the air and everything stopped. The audience was dead silent. Sarah, for the first time, looked up and her eyes were wide. It was as if someone had finally named the ghost that had been haunting her house for 2 decades. Mark looked like I had slapped him. The mask wasn't just cracked, it was shattered. And for the first time, we were seeing the scared, insecure man who had been hiding behind it all along. That moment of breakthrough, when the carefully constructed facade shatters, is the most critical juncture on my stage. What happens next determines everything. Some people double down. They get angrier, louder, more defensive. Their ego, wounded, goes into full-on combat mode. Others just break. Mark broke, The anger that flashed in his eyes a moment before just evaporated, and it was replaced by a raw, naked panic. He looked smaller on the couch, like the air had been let out of him. I'm not a manipulator, he stammered, but the conviction was gone. The words were hollow. He wasn't saying it to convince me. He was saying it to convince himself. And he was failing, aren't you? I asked, but my tone had shifted. The confrontation phase was over. The sharp edge was gone, replaced by a firm, but not unkind, directness. Let's look at the definition, Mark. A manipulator reframes reality to serve their own emotional needs. They avoid accountability by shifting blame. They use guilt and other people's sense of obligation to control them. Have you or have you not spent your entire marriage blaming Sarah for your professional disappointments so you wouldn't have to face your own fear of failure? He didn't answer. He just stared at his hands. Beside him, Sarah started to cry. But these weren't the silent, defeated tears from before. This was a different kind of crying. It was a release of pressure that had been building for 20 years. It was the sound of validation. I turned to her. Sarah, for 2 decades, you've been living in a distorted reality. You've been told that your prudence is sabotage, your questions are attacks, and your desire for security is a character flaw. You've been made to feel responsible for this man's happiness and for his success, and that is a burden that no person should ever have to carry. It was never your job to make him successful. It was your job to be his partner, not his scapegoat. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. It was a small movement, but it was everything. It was her taking back her own reality. Now, here's where the real work begins. It's not enough to just shatter a man's defenses. You can't leave him in a pile of rubble. You have to give him the tools to rebuild. Mark, I said, my voice softer now. I'm not saying you're a bad man. I don't believe you woke up every morning and thought, how can I manipulate my wife today? This is a pattern. It's a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. Somewhere along the line, you learned that admitting fault was catastrophic. You learned that being wrong was an existential threat to your identity. Where did that come from? This is the pivot. We move from the what to the why. And as is so often the case, the why started in childhood. Mark's father was a hypercritical, demanding man, an engineer who saw the world in black and white, right and wrong. Success was lauded, but failure wasn't just corrected, it was ridiculed. If Mark got a B on a test, the question wasn't, how can you do better next time? It was, what's wrong with you that you couldn't get an A? He grew up in an environment where the slightest mistake was proof of a fundamental inadequacy. So he learned to hide his mistakes. He learned to get very, very good at creating narratives where nothing was ever his fault. The dog ate his homework. The teacher didn't explain the material properly. The questions on the test were unfair. It started as a survival skill for a little boy trying to navigate the emotional minefield of his own home, but he never outgrew it. He carried that same toolkit into his adult life and into his marriage. Sarah didn't marry a man. She married that little boy's defense mechanism. As he talked about his father, his voice changed. The bluster was gone. He sounded like that child, uncertain, scared, and desperate for approval. He was describing the very fear he'd been projecting onto Sarah for years. The fear of not being good enough. He wasn't a monster. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison built with bricks of childhood fear and mortared with a lifetime of blame. This is the heart of it. People don't behave in a vacuum. His manipulative behavior wasn't born out of malice, but out of a profound and crippling insecurity. That doesn't excuse it. It doesn't make the pain he caused Sarah any less real, but it explains it. and you cannot change what you do not understand. The outcome for Mark and Sarah was not a Hollywood ending. It wasn't a magic wand and a happily ever after. Real change is slow, and it is hard. They did not walk off my stage hand in hand into the sunset. The damage was too deep, the patterns too ingrained for a 1-hour television show to fix. The outcome was something far more realistic and in its own way, more hopeful. For Sarah, the show was a liberation. It was the moment she was given permission to trust her own instincts again. She came to me asking if she was sane, and she left knowing that she was. She understood that she was not the problem. Her desire for stability was not a flaw. Her role was not to be the silent shock absorber for her husband's fragile ego. We set her up with a therapist who specialized in codependency and emotional abuse. Her journey was about rediscovering her own voice, rebuilding her self-esteem, and learning to set boundaries that were not just healthy, but non-negotiable. It was about learning that no is a complete sentence. For Mark, the journey was much more difficult. His entire world had been turned upside down. The operating system he had used for 40 years had just crashed. He had to start from scratch. He also agreed to therapy. But his path was about deconstructing that fortress of blame brick by brick and learning the terrifying skill of vulnerability. He had to learn that failure is not a verdict on your worth as a human being. It's just a data point. It's feedback. He had to learn to sit with the discomfort of being wrong. He had to learn to say the words, "I'm sorry," not as a strategy to end a fight, but as a genuine admission of fault. And he had to learn to say, "I failed," and let the sentence end there without adding, "because of Sarah." I can't tell you if they stayed together. What I can tell you is that they both left with a chance to have an honest life. Sarah had the chance to live a life free from the suffocating weight of unearned guilt, and Mark, for the first time, had the chance to live a life free from the exhausting, isolating, and ultimately lonely job of maintaining a fiction. He could finally stop running from himself. The real outcome wasn't about saving a marriage. It was about the possibility of saving two souls. And sometimes that has to be enough. True change doesn't always look like a repaired relationship. Sometimes it looks like two people finally walking down their own healthier paths, even if those paths lead in different directions.